After the War of the Spanish Succession, thousands of ex-privateers and impoverished sailors flocked to Nassau in the Bahamas to sail under the black flag as pirates. By 1715, the self-proclaimed Republic of Pirates on New Providence Island had a sizable population of thieves, cutthroats, and rogues of all types, each seeking to earn their fortune, stealing cargo and goods from the merchant navies of Great Britain, France, and Spain. The West Indies became a dangerous place, infested with pirates operating out of Nassau. However, the pirates' reign of terror would not last long, and in 1718, the British developed a plan to reclaim Nassau and restore order in the West Indies. In our second video on the golden age of piracy, we will be diving into the final years of the post-Spanish succession period, discussing how Woodes Rogers ended the pirate republic in Nassau, as well as Blackbeard's final battle.
Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible.
The first significant blow to the pirates of the post-Spanish succession period was the death of one of their most successful captains, Samuel Black Sam Bellamy. At midnight on April the 26th, 1717, Bellamy's ship, the Whydah galley, became caught in a violent nor'easter cyclone off Cape Cod. Crewmen struggled to follow Bellamy's orders as waves crashed on deck, but they managed to turn the ship's bow into the wind and drop anchor. Yet, when the anchors started to drag, everyone realized the Whydah was doomed. Bellamy ordered the anchors cut and for the helmsman to steer closer to shore, so that the crew might be saved. At first, it seemed like the ship would reach the nearby beach, but then the horrified crew watched as they slipped stern first over 30-foot waves. The Whydah forcefully ran aground at the foot of the cliffs, throwing men off the rigging into the churning waves, while cannon broke loose from their tackles and crushed everyone in their path. The turbulent storm brought down the ship's main mast, and waves spilled over the deck and poured onto the decks below. At dawn, the Whydah galley's hull finally broke apart. The storm raged on through the morning, casting mangled bodies onto the shore. Samuel Bellamy and 160 of his crew had all perished in the storm. The greatest blow dealt to the pirates of Nassau came in December 1717. When word reached New Providence that King George I had issued a proclamation in September, decreeing that any pirate who surrendered to the British within the year would receive a full pardon for all crimes committed before January 5, 1718. These pardons had been conceived by Woodes Rogers, an English sea captain who had served as a privateer in the War of the Spanish Succession, and had now been appointed the new governor of the Bahamas. With news of the royal pardon, Nassau's pirates broke down into 2 factions. Many of the moderate pirates, mostly former privateers like Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold, welcomed the pardon as an opportunity to regain their legitimacy and invest their loot in commercial trade. The other faction, led by Charles Vane, were embittered and angry men who saw themselves not as businessmen, but as thieves and outlaws, rebelling against a society ruled by wealthy elites who cared only for themselves. Consequently, they rejected the pardon categorically. Until this point, Vane had largely remained outside of the power structure in Nassau. Now, he led an angry mob of pirates to Fort Nassau, cut down the Union Jack raised by Jennings' followers, and hoisted a black flag in its place. The situation in Nassau remained tense throughout January 1718, and the pirates gathered in a general council to resolve their differences. Vane and his supporters argued they should fortify the island and force King George to negotiate with them. At the same time, Jennings and Hornigold insisted they should take the pardon and surrender without resistance when the new royal governor arrived. The arguments became heated, and the council broke up without reaching a consensus. With that, many pirates began to pack up and leave Nassau. On the evening of July 24th, Woodes Rogers' ship dropped anchor in the harbour of Nassau, accompanied by a small flotilla of warships and transports, commanded by Commodore Peter Chamberlain, aboard the 36-gun frigate HMS Milford. By now, Charles Vane and his crew had already been planning to leave Nassau, but the harbour exit was now guarded by 2 warships of Rogers' flotilla, the 20-gun frigate HMS Rose and the 10-gun sloop of war Shark. Unable to escape, Vane decided upon a bold strategy. At 2 a.m., Vane's ship weighed anchor and headed towards the flotilla. All the guns had been unloaded. One pirate remained at the helm to steer the ship straight at the Rose and the Shark, while other pirates set the rigging and pitch-soaked decks alight. The pirates abandoned the ship as it ploughed through the water towards the naval vessels. Before the fireship could collide with them, the frenzied British crews worked to cut their anchors and sail to open sea. The warships just narrowly got underway and escaped the blazing inferno. Vane watched all this transpire from the deck of his swift sloop, the Catherine. Although he was disappointed his fireship had not damaged the warships, it bought Vane time to make final preparations to run Rogers' blockade. At 7 a.m., just as the entirety of Rogers' flotilla appeared at the harbour entrance, Vane weighed anchor and set sail. The Catherine sped through the narrow eastern harbour entrance, pursued by the sloop of war Buck. Although his pursuers were gaining on him, the Catherine finally rounded the eastern end of New Providence, and the crew loosed all sails into the wind. As Vane's men fired shots at the Buck, the British were finally forced to call off the chase. Charles Vane had escaped and would remain at large, but Woodes Rogers now had Nassau. On July 26th, Rogers landed ashore and was joyously received by the pro-pardon pirates. Benjamin Hornigold led Rogers through the crumbling Fort Nassau, where the new governor addressed the gathered crowd of 300 people by reading aloud the King's commission appointing him governor of the Bahamas. Over the next few days, Rogers oversaw the consolidation of his control over New Providence, and his 100-man independent company of British troops took control of Fort Nassau. In a makeshift office, he consulted with prominent residents to serve on his 12-man governing council. Rogers knew that Vane was still at large, and Spain still posed a threat. Consequently, Fort Nassau had to be repaired and refurbished, but labour shortages delayed this work. An unidentified disease had spread amongst the Nassau population, severely affecting the soldiers, sailors and colonists Rogers had brought with him to the island. Long-time residents of the island had developed a strong resistance to such diseases, but the newcomers were unaccustomed to tropical climate and were highly susceptible. Rogers himself became ill, and by mid-August was unable to attend meetings. The disease also killed off much of the cattle on New Providence, depleting the people's food supply. As if that wasn't bad enough, long-time Nassau residents resisted Rogers' efforts to put them to work. Around this time, Commodore Chamberlain announced that his 3 warships were leaving. War was looming with Spain again, and they were needed elsewhere. Rogers insisted they stay, as the island was still vulnerable with the current state of its fortifications. Chamberlain, however, asserted that his ships had no orders to remain. Since Rogers had no authority over the Royal Navy Commodore, he had no choice but to beg. Chamberlain finally agreed to leave behind the 20-gun Rose for another 3 weeks, while Rogers worked on the fortifications, after which they too would depart. At 9:30 a.m. on August 16th, the Milford and Shark departed Nassau for New York. Things only grew worse for Governor Rogers after that. Heavy thunderstorms hit the island for 2 weeks, while Rogers' lieutenants tried their best to get the lazy ex-pirates to fix up the fort. More bad news came when it was discovered that the Spanish Guardas Costas vessels had been sailing around New Providence, gathering intelligence on the island and Nassau for an imminent invasion, for Great Britain had renewed conflict with Spain in the War of the Quadruple Alliance. Now, on top of reorganizing New Providence into a productive British colony, Governor Rogers would have to defend it from the Spanish. While Woodes Rogers busied himself with restoring order in Nassau, another prominent pirate captain was still at large, and that pirate was none other than Blackbeard. After learning of the royal proclamation, Blackbeard came to realize that the pirates' reign over the high seas was nearing its end. Although he respected Charles Vane's determination to fight on to the end as a pirate, Blackbeard had no intention of going out in a blaze of glory. He wished to get away from the pirate's life and lie low in order to eventually settle down somewhere with his riches. But Blackbeard decided that in order to set himself up with enough wealth to settle down for good, he needed to pull off one more big score. Perhaps at the suggestion of the gentleman pirate, Stede Bonnet, Blackbeard decided to blockade Charleston, South Carolina. On May 22, 1718, Blackbeard's fleet arrived off the Charleston Bar, 9 miles south of the colony, seizing the pilot boat before they could raise the alarm. They then waited at the approaches to fall upon unsuspecting ships. Within days, at least 5 ships had been captured and looted. One ship they captured was transporting prominent passengers to London, among whom several were distinguished citizens of Charleston. Blackbeard decided to hold these people captive to demand a ransom for a chest of medical supplies containing medicine that could treat an outbreak of syphilis among the crew. Governor Robert Johnson immediately agreed to the demand. The chest of medicines was delivered to Blackbeard, along with a message from Governor Johnson offering to pardon Blackbeard if he laid down his arms. Though Blackbeard rejected the offer, he kept good to his ransom, releasing the captives and their plundered vessels. After this, Blackbeard's ships left Charleston, and 6 days later they turned into Topsail Inlet, halfway up North Carolina's swampy coast. While navigating the inlet's uncharted shoals, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran into the sandy shoals. As Blackbeard's ship began listing to port and took on water, efforts to try and drag the Queen Anne's Revenge off the shoal failed, dooming her. With the ship lost, the pirates all transferred to Bonnet's former ship, the Revenge, then sailed up to Beaufort. To everyone's surprise, Blackbeard announced he would give command of the ship back to Bonnet, and the gentleman pirate took a shallow boat to shore towards Beaufort to receive a pardon at once, promising to return for the rest of the men shortly after. Just after Bonnet left, Blackbeard's crew took Bonnet's shipmates captive, stranding 16 of them on a sandy, uninhabited island off the mainland. Another 200 of the pirates were abandoned in Beaufort, as Blackbeard and his shipmates took one of the Spanish sloops they had captured and sailed away. Leaving Bonnet behind at Beaufort, Blackbeard and his men sailed up to Bath, the capital of the North Carolina colony, where he surrendered to Governor Charles Eden, bribing him into receiving a pardon. Over the summer, Blackbeard spent much of his time between Bath and his favorite anchorage, Ocracoke Inlet on the Outer Banks. He even met with Charles Vane at Ocracoke after the latter escaped from Nassau in July. With Governor Eden in his pocket, Blackbeard had practically turned North Carolina into a pirate lair for himself. In the meantime, Stede Bonnet and his crew were captured at the mouth of Cape Fear River on September 27th, and all but 4 were convicted of piracy and hanged in Charleston, bringing an ignominious end to the career of the so-called gentleman pirate. It would be the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spottswood, who would commence the final hunt for Blackbeard. Spottswood had kept track of Blackbeard's pirating activities for months. In early October 1718, he met with Royal Navy captains Ellis Brand and George Gordon, requesting their assistance in hunting the notorious pirate down. Spottswood's plan called for a two-pronged assault on Blackbeard's main hideaways at Bath and Ocracoke Island, with Brand leading a contingent of Marines overland to Bath, while the second force blockaded Ocracoke. For the expedition, Spottswood provided the captains with 2 sloops at his own expense. The ships would be placed under the command of Gordon's first officer, Lieutenant Robert Maynard. Spottswood's plan was entirely illegal, as no colonial or military officials had the authority to invade another British colony. Nevertheless, the governor's expedition departed Hampton on November 17th, with Maynard commanding aboard the larger sloop Jane. The other sloop, Ranger, was captained by Midshipman Edmund Hyde of the HMS Line. At 3 p.m., the ships sailed out of Hampton Roads. Just hours after Maynard weighed anchor, Captain Brand and a small contingent of sailors left Hampton Village, traveling down the Virginia countryside and into North Carolina. 6 days later, Brand's men reached the outskirts of Bath at about 10 p.m. on November 23rd. Scouts reported that Blackbeard was not in town, so Brand went straight to the plantation house of Governor Eden, where he stated his purpose in hunting down and capturing Blackbeard. Elsewhere, though, events had already transpired that brought the hunt to a close. At 4 p.m. on November 21st, 2 days before Brand arrived at Bath, Lieutenant Maynard's 2 ships reached Ocracoke Island and spotted 2 sloops behind the island. One was armed with 9 guns and matched the description of Blackbeard's ship Adventure. With the sun already setting, Maynard decided against a night assault, and instead prepared for an attack the next day, as Blackbeard's crew partied and drank the night away beside bonfires on shore. At 9 a.m. on November 22nd, Maynard sailed his sloops straight towards the Adventure to try and board her while she was still uncrewed. Midshipman Hyde's Ranger ran aground on a sandbar as they approached. Still, Maynard continued with the larger Jane until he too ran aground, eliminating all chances of a surprise attack. When Blackbeard's crew realized they were being attacked, they rushed to the Adventure and hurriedly set off. Hyde finally got the Ranger free and sped towards Blackbeard's ship, but when the Ranger came within close range, Blackbeard's guns unleashed a broadside. The Ranger was hit across the foredeck, killing Hyde and his second-in-command. Wounded men littered the blood-stained deck, and some sailors fired their muskets at the Adventure as she sailed past them. One lucky musket shot hit the line holding the Adventure's foresails, and the ship began to lose speed. Just then, Maynard's crew got the Jane afloat and rowed towards the Adventure to try to board her. The 2 ships closed to within 50 yards when Blackbeard's gunners opened another broadside with deadly grape shot, killing or wounding 21 crewmen on the Jane. Blackbeard believed the battle was over and that he had won. He pulled the Adventure alongside the sloop to board her. However, Maynard had ordered the uninjured men to hide in the Jane's hold, and they now awaited the lieutenant's signal. Blackbeard was the first of his crew to board the sloop. At the signal, Maynard rushed from the hold, armed with his sword in hand, accompanied by a dozen other sailors. Blackbeard and Maynard faced one another in a dramatic sword duel. Maynard thrust his blade against Blackbeard's cartridge box, bending it to the hilt. Then Blackbeard shattered the guard of his enemy's sword and sliced his fingers with a single swift blow. Maynard jumped back and fired his pistol, wounding his opponent. By now, more of Blackbeard's men were jumping aboard and engaged in a vicious brawl with Maynard's crew. The Jane's helmsman, Abraham Demelt, assisted Maynard and slashed Blackbeard across the face. The pirates were outnumbered, and many soon fell dead onto the bloody deck. Several more sailors fired at Blackbeard with their pistols, but amazingly, Blackbeard kept swinging at Maynard as blood spilled across his body and face. More shots tore through Blackbeard, Then all the sailors surrounded him with their swords drawn. According to one account, a Scots Highlander in Maynard's crew finally delivered a heavy sword swing that severed Blackbeard's head. He had already received 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts across his body. The whole ordeal ended in just 6 minutes, and all of Blackbeard's pirates were killed. Blackbeard, the most fearsome pirate of his day and the terror of the seas for over a year, was dead. His head was strung up on the Adventure's bowsprit, and after Maynard returned to Virginia, it was stuck on a pole at the entrance to Hampton Roads for all to see. The death of Blackbeard dealt a fatal blow to the golden age of piracy. Back in the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers worked tirelessly to restore civilization to Nassau and led the colony's defense against a Spanish attack in 1720. However, Rogers lacked support from home in England, and upon his return to London in March 1721, he discovered that a new governor had been appointed, and he was sent to debtor's prison. Even so, Woodes Rogers' thankless efforts in governing Nassau had worked, and by 1722, order had been restored to the island. With Charles Vane's capture and execution by the British in 1721, and Jack Rackham following him a year later, most of the notorious pirates that had been the scourge of the West Indies were gone. Although some pirates still prowled the Caribbean, by 1726 they were no longer the menace they had been the decade before, marking the end of the golden age of piracy. The post-Spanish succession period pirates, despite their notorious criminality, had caught the attention and interest of the general public. With the publication, in 1724, of the book A General History of the Pirates, the feared pirates of Nassau in the West Indies gained a legendary, almost mythical status in popular culture. Centuries later, the pirates of the Caribbean continue to captivate people's imaginations, remaining a strong part of popular culture. More videos on the rogues and scoundrels of world history are on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video. To watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.